Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Kurt DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. Today, we'll be taking a virtual visit to Harewood House in Yorkshire to explore its newest exhibition, which celebrates the 250th anniversaries of two British cultural icons, novelist Jane Austen and artist JMW Turner. For the very first time, the work of these two legendary creatives has been brought together in Austen Turner, a country house encounter, an exhibition that reveals the artist's shared interest in the social and cultural life of the British country house and how that interest continues to shape our understanding of this world today. I would like to thank the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation for their generous support of the Art and Architecture webinar series. We could not mount these webinars without the support of donors like the Cornell Foundation and you. Beckie Burton is the Curator and Archivist at Harewood House. She has a master's degree in decorative arts and historic interiors from the University of Buckingham and has worked with the collections at Harewood for over a decade. Please join me in welcoming Beckie.
Well, hi everyone, and thanks so much for that introduction, Kurt. I'm really pleased to be here today and excited to show you all a few highlights from our current exhibition. However, before I do this, and just for some context, for those of you who might not be familiar with Harewood, I thought I'd give you a very quick overview of the building itself. So this is Harewood House, based just outside of Leeds in West Yorkshire. It was built in the 18th century between 1759 and 1771, and it was built by the Lascelles family, and it's been their home to this very day. And I would say, or I always tend to say, there are four key individuals involved in this building's creation. So we've got the architect, John Carr of York, who obviously was a locally born architect working in the Palladian style. All of the principal interiors of the house were created by the Scottish neoclassical architect Robert Adam. And in fact, Harewood was Robert Adam's single biggest commission by the number of rooms that he ever created for a single building. So if you ever want to come and see lots of Robert Adam, then you should come to Harewood. And the house, of course, was furnished from top to bottom by the locally born cabinet maker Thomas Chippendale. He was born in Otley, just about 8 miles away from Harewood. And again, Harewood was Chippendale's biggest ever commission too. So we really do kind of pride ourselves on having one of the best collections of Chippendale as well anywhere in the world. And finally, of course, the famous landscape designer Capability Brown was also brought in to landscape the grounds around the house. And you can see from this picture here, the landscape at the back in his kind of characteristic naturalistic style. The terrace at the front there of this image was actually a Victorian addition to the house, put in by the architect Sir Charles Barry during the Victorian period. So Harewood really is a kind of a tour de force of 18th century household names. But we mustn't forget that this kind of coming together of creativity and craftsmanship was created, of course, at a price, a human cost. It was funded pretty much entirely from the proceeds of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved African people. The Lascelles family were one of the largest landowners in the Caribbean. They own 24 plantations across the islands of Barbados, Jamaica, Grenada and Tobago, and amassed a huge fortune based on this deep involvement with the slave trade and its associated industries. And today at Harewood, we are very open about this fact, and we do try to engage directly with the legacy of slavery in Britain today. And I will actually come back to this aspect of Harewood's history later in the presentation. But on to our current exhibition then, Austen Turner, a country house encounter, which runs around the full extent of the principal floor of the house, which consists of 17 rooms, so you can imagine the size of the exhibition itself. And it brings together, as Kurt was saying, two of the biggest names in British culture, the novelist Jane Austen and the painter JMW Turner. No pressure, right? And we brought them together to celebrate both of their 250th anniversaries. And I have to admit, it was definitely news to me when the concept for this show was initially proposed, that they were actually born in the same year, 1775. But they were, in fact, exact contemporaries. You know, they were kind of inhabiting the same world, being inspired by the same things, and being innovative in a time of kind of great significance and change in British history. And this exhibition, which has been curated in partnership with the Centre for 18th Century Studies at the University of York, and we've also had help from two independent curators as well, Jade Foster and Diane House. We certainly could not have put this exhibition on without their specialist help. I'm definitely not an Austen or a Turner specialist. But this exhibition really proposes a speculative encounter between the two, a kind of a what-if scenario that essentially explores where Austen and Turner's social lives and kind of creative careers overlapped and intersected. And happily for us at Harewood, after much discussion and research, the British country house as an institution really did kind of emerge as their social and artistic common ground, being both key sources of both inspiration and innovation as well. And actually, what I would encourage you to do as this talk progresses is just to have a think about your own perceptions of the British country house and the Regency period in general, and how Austen and Turner's creative legacies kind of continue to shape our visions of this world. I don't think it would be wildly off the mark to suggest that, you know, we often think of the country house through, you know, the eyes of Austen in Turner in one way or another. And certainly in the UK, of course, we even carry Austen and Turner around in our pockets, so they're rarely far from view. Here they are on our £10 and £20 banknotes. So this is the sort of the concept for the exhibition as a whole, but I know what you're all thinking. Did these icons of literature and art ever meet for real? And the answer, sadly, is probably not, but they almost did. And their paths almost crossed at different stages of their lives. Turner's uncle, for instance, knew Austen's father through his work as a curate. And in 1813, Austen attended an exhibition at the Royal Academy in London, where Turner was Professor of Perspective, which is a rather brilliant job title, and where Austen certainly would have seen Turner's work on the walls. And this sort of near miss, as it were, is why this idea of kind of a speculative encounter was so tantalising for us in terms of framing the concept for this show. And it's here I just want to pause for a second on this curious little watercolour sketch here. And if I could just have the next slide, please. Thank you. And here I'm actually showing you this image of me installing the work, just to give you a sense of scale, because when you actually see kind of a close-up of the work, It's hard to get a sense of just how small it is, but it's kind of the size of an A5 sheet of paper. Now, this little work was painted by Turner in 1827. And what we have here is two very quickly sketched figures. We've got a man and a woman. The man stands on the left with his hands in his pocket and his head angled as though in conversation. The woman sits on a chair, her back towards us, and her head is turned slightly towards the right. There's clearly kind of some kind of social interaction going on here, which could be interpreted in many ways. But most significantly, I think, these are clearly anonymous figures, but who appear to be almost sort of hovering on the page, hovering in sort of space and time. Could they be Austen or Turner? Well, obviously not, but this image at least offered a really useful visual prompt for the kind of the coming together of these two iconic figures, and it's the first work that visitors see when they enter the show, and it really is a kind of our starting point for the exhibition. Now, this sketch actually belongs to a group of watercolours that Turner painted during a visit to Petworth House in Sussex, the estate owned by George Wyndham, the third Earl of Egremont. And it does offer, I think, a kind of a fleeting glimpse into the elite social life of the British country house. You know, you've probably got two family members here, perhaps, or even guests to the house sharing a private moment, almost a little bit like characters of an Austen novel, observed in an awkward kind of first encounter. But the reality is, and this I think actually is the most interesting thing about Austen and Turner and their relationship to the country house, is the fact that they were both outsiders to this world. They were invited guests and became very acute and critical observers of this elite setting. And honestly, this kind of unique perspective, as well as, of course, their innovative artistic practices, I think is why their visions of the British country house have very much persisted to this day. And just as a way of emphasising this, it's worth kind of taking a quick look at both Austen and Turner's birthplaces, which give us a bit of a clue to their kind of background and social class as well. So here we have Turner's birthplace. Turner was very much of a working class background. He was the son of a barber and was born above his father's shop in Covent Garden, right in the kind of the commercial hub of London, which was surrounded by theatres and taverns and brothels. And as it happens, Covent Garden was also the heart of the London art world as well. And this was sort of very fortuitous for Turner because obviously his artistic ability became apparent at an early age. And he actually became enrolled at the Royal Academy schools at the age of just 14. And his career kind of really progressed from there and at speed as well. Eventually, he became a painter, or certainly the painter of choice, for a network of wealthy landowning families across the country. And they would invite him into their homes to produce pictures of their country estates. And it's worth saying here at this point that Edward Viscount Lascelles, who was the son of the first Earl of Harewood, was one of those individuals. And I'm sorry, I forgot to include a portrait of Edward here, but actually he was known as the Pretender, and that's because he looked very much like the Prince of Wales. So if you can imagine a picture of him in your head, then you're pretty much imagining Edward. But Edward really was Turner's kind of first major patron, and it's why we have such a wonderful collection of Turners at Harewood today. He visited Harewood in 1797, probably for about a week-long visit, and he created a series of sketches of the landscape that went on to create what we would call a series of country house portraits, which actually on the last slide, if you see them together, they create a kind of a 360 sort of view of the house, kind of view around the building. The next slide here, we see a close-up of the house from the northeast by Turner, on the right-hand side here. And I always think it's instructive to compare this picture with the same view of the house painted by Thomas Moulton, Turner's drawing master, almost 20 years earlier, because it just shows how, I think, innovative Turner was and just how much he was kind of pushing the boundaries of this medium. Turner is using, obviously, watercolour in his image, but he's basically using it as though he was painting in oils. And you can see here, you know, the saturation of colour in his image and the expressiveness of the scene. By comparison to the Moulton there on the left, his work is, you know, much more kind of interested in topographical accuracy. And it's also only very lightly tinted in terms of colour as well, which was very typical of watercolour painting in this sort of earlier period. Also, interestingly, the scene has been dressed in Moulton's picture with what we would call staffage, which is a word to describe kind of stock figures used to illustrate architectural plans. Whereas with Turner's image there, you know, you can really tell that his figures animating the picture were very much observed from life. So moving on then to Austen. Austen's family was of a higher social standing than Turner's. Certainly, she was very much of the kind of the gentry class, but she was still not from an aristocratic background, and her family did not have unlimited means by comparison to, say, you know, the Lascelles family, for instance. And Austen spent the first 25 years of her life at the here in Steventon Rectory, this relatively modest building in Hampshire, where her father was rector, and from where he also ran a boarding school as well to supplement his clerical income. And actually, after Austen's father's death, she remained financially reliant upon her brothers for the rest of her life. And so when she did visit country houses, like this property here, Godmersham Park in Kent, she often did so as a family guest or as a dependent relative. And this was one of the Godmersham Park, was one of 3 estates belonging to her brother, Edward Austen Knight. And I should say here that Edward ascended the social ladder higher than any of his siblings, thanks to his adoption by wealthy relatives. And at Godmersham, Austen took advantage of a well-stocked library. But, well, it's interesting to note she was also expected to earn her keep by entertaining her nieces and nephews, so effectively being used as a kind of free childcare. And I should probably explain at this point as well Harewood's connection to Jane Austen, which I have to admit is slightly more tenuous than the connection to Turner. Sadly, we don't know that Austen ever came to Yorkshire, never mind Harewood. However, we do know that the Lascelles family were reading Austen. So this here on the left-hand side is the family's first edition copy of Sense and Sensibility, which is in the exhibition. It's very well thumbed, and it's also bound in the Lascelles family's sort of characteristic leather binding, and you can also see their book plate there as well. The set of books on the right, on the other hand, is another set of first editions held by the collection of Jane Austen's house in Chawton. And this set is still in their publishing boards. And this is how the books would have actually been sold to the reader directly. And it was then down to the individual to rebind the book so that it then matched their kind of house style of library bindings, for instance. And obviously this is something that the Lascelles family clearly did. And just as well, before I move on, the other very significant Austen Harewood connection is the fact that Austen actually named a peripheral character in Mansfield Park after the Lascelles family. So a Lady Lascelles is mentioned. And this is certainly a knowing kind of nod to the Lascelles family's connection to the trade in enslaved people, which is a key theme, of course, of the novel itself, of Mansfield Park. So this reference certainly was not made by accident. Now, after that kind of fairly long-winded introduction to the exhibition, I now kind of want to take you on a bit of a tour of the country house and its landscape, picking out objects from the exhibition that really sort of showcase how and why the country house really was this kind of metaphorical meeting place for Austen and Turner. And I should say as well at this point that, you know, most of the items that I'm going to be showing you today are made up of a combination of objects from artworks from the Harewood collection, but also from a number of major loans as well from other organisations and private lenders as well from across the country. So I want to start this tour outside in the picturesque grounds and landscapes that surrounded the country house. And it's this word, the picturesque, that I want to hone in on. Everyone knows what the word picturesque means today. You know, it's usually used as an opinion on whether a landscape is considered beautiful or pleasing to the eye. However, this was a term that actually came about in the 18th century, and it was much more about a kind of a way or a method of looking at a landscape according to a series of strict aesthetic principles, and that then created essentially a picturesque view for the viewer to admire. So, for instance, for visual artists like Turner, this involved creating a kind of an ideal scene with a balanced foreground, middle ground, background, a mixture of light and shade, and often a picturesque scene would be enlivened with a romantic tumble-down ruin or a grand country house placed in harmony with nature. And here, of course, you can see a view of Harewood Castle by Turner, and it very, you know, exactly kind of creates this picturesque effect. And I should just draw your attention as well, sort of towards the right-hand side of the picture, you can just see two figures sort of lounging on the banks of the hill there. And one of them actually has a sketchbook in his lap. So we think this possibly could be a self-portrait of Turner. He's painted himself into his own picture, possibly with Edward Viscount Lascelles or with maybe his artistic friend and rival, Thomas Girton, who also visited Harewood. We're not sure, but a nice little detail there. So this concept of the picturesque grew rapidly in popularity in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And it grew alongside the growth in domestic tourism in the UK, encouraged, for instance, by like the Napoleonic Wars, which made travel to the continent more difficult, which then obviously naturally encouraged people to get out in nature and explore the British countryside in kind of more depth. And of course, through that, the country house naturally became an attraction in its own right. And of course, many of Austen's characters kind of go travelling around the country visiting these kinds of places. And this period is when we see a kind of a growth in popularity. Oh, actually, if we just flick back onto the previous slide just for a second there, thank you. This is when we see a growth in popularity of things like country house guidebooks and souvenirs. This is actually one of my favourite objects from the show. It's a pocket writing set. It's very tiny. Again, it's difficult to sense the scale of the object here, but basically you can fit it in the palm of your hand. So it's got these absolutely tiny, very cute ink pots and a space for a folding pen as well at the back. And this is almost certainly Harewood's first tourist souvenir, as it were, emblazoned with a transfer image of Harewood House across the front, and inside a reference to the nearby spa town of Harrogate as well. And of course, this not only would have reminded you of your visit to Harewood, but it was also a very practical object, and it would have enabled the owner to document what you were seeing whilst you were on the move, whether that's in the form of poetry or perhaps to write a letter about your travels, whichever. It was all about kind of encouraging creativity on the move. This object also indicates that the picturesque wasn't just for visual artists, but it was also something that writers were very much interested in. Many novels of the period were shaped by the language of the picturesque, and we know Austen was a particular fan of it. So Austen's brother, Henry, he tells us that Jane was a warm and judicious admirer of landscape, and that she was enamoured with the idea of the picturesque. And all of her novels bear the influence of this aesthetic concept, especially in the description of houses and estates, and often a character's appreciation of those places, and also the picturesque, was associated with the character's taste or maturity, or perhaps even a change of opinion. And just look at this here. This, of course, is the famous quote from Pride and Prejudice when Elizabeth first witnesses Pemberley House. And here she uses picturesque to kind of observe and describe the journey through the Pemberley landscape. And Elizabeth later even admits in the book that this was the moment, seeing his landscape in his house, this was the moment she realised her love for Darcy. And by the way, I'm just sort of playfully juxtaposing this description of Pemberley with Turner's view of Harewood from the southeast, because in my view, it could almost read as an illustration of this description, and demonstrates how the picturesque kind of crosses the visual and written medium. Another key area of creative overlap for Austen and Turner within this remit of landscape is the fact that journeying through the landscape, personally for both of them, was central to their creative practices. Turner's artistic process, of course, began whilst journeying, filling his sketchbooks with carefully observed drawings of the places and landscapes that he encountered. And he really did travel all over the country. He also travelled extensively on the continent as well. And all of his travels were documented across, I think, about 300 of his sketchbooks, which today reside in the Tate's collection. And we are incredibly lucky to have Turner's actual sketchbook, the very one that he used and carried about the Harewood landscape, on display in the house at the moment. Again, as I say, on loan from Tate. And you can see here that this is a leather-bound sketchbook with buckles on either side to keep everything neat. And he also etched some of the locations he visited with it on the sort of the front cover of the book too. And it also meant that other tools of his trade were also portable. So particularly the newly accessible medium of watercolour. Unlike traditional oil paint, watercolour could be used easily outdoors, enabling Turner to capture those kind of subtle light and weather effects that he was so famous for. And this type of paint set here would of course be used on the move. And this one's really rather special. This one was actually handmade by Turner himself. So it's made using 2 pieces of card, which Turner stuck these little kind of watercolour paint cakes onto, and then he folded some linen around them. So pretty rough and ready, and you can see it's obviously very well used as well. And you can see the colours that obviously he was using most often, quite a lot of these yellows and earthy colours, lots of blues for the sky as well. And then, of course, once back in the studio, he developed these sketches into finished pictures, such as those he produced for the Lascelles family. So here's the sketch from for Harewood House from the house, and then you can compare it there with the final image. Austen, too, of course, was creative on the move, and one of Austen's most prized possessions was her portable writing desk, which enabled her to draft letters and novels anywhere she might find herself. Sadly, we haven't actually got Austen's actual writing desk. It does survive in the exhibition. It's shown here on the left there, belongs to the British Library. But we do have one which is very similar, which you can see in the other image, that belonged to the Lascelles family, and that's dated to the late 19th century. And there's one famous story that on one visit to her brother, Edward Knight's estate in Godmershire in Kent, where her portable desk was accidentally packed onto the wrong carriage. And this carriage was going for onward travel to the Caribbean. So when this was discovered, Jane was, of course, distraught, and they had to dispatch a fast rider to catch the carriage in order to get it back. And to her immense relief, it was relieved. And just to illustrate this little episode here, with this rather wonderful picture by Turner, which shows the carriage drive at Farnley Hall, which is another country house actually just down the road from Harewood, and it's somewhere that Turner visited often. But it captures this kind of horse and carriage charging up towards the house with dust flying from its wheels. And there's something about this picture for me that Turner manages to capture kind of a real sense of anticipation in this image, which to me has an Austen-esque sort of feel to it. You know, who is it that approaches so quickly in the carriage? You know, what news will they bring, or what people will they bring? So moving on from domestic landscapes, here is where I kind of want to segue into thinking about the global country house landscape. So just as the picturesque altered how people in Britain viewed the land close to home, it also influenced how colonised spaces were depicted by artists, mapmakers, settlers, travellers. And in the representation of plantation landscapes, the picturesque became essentially another export, another tool that could be used to impose a British colonial perspective on other places. And of course, the picturesque style tended towards the romantic. In Turner's view of the Harewood estate here on the right, labourers are shown working in harmony with the land, overseen by this kind of watchful presence of the Lascelles family's country seat. And the global picturesque mirrors in the picture on the left, mirrors this impulse by minimising the presence of enslaved workers on British-owned plantations, and denying the brutality of colonial life. And here in this image of Bell Plantation in Barbados, this was owned by the Lascelles family. You can just about see kind of right on the far right-hand side of the image, the presence of houses that likely belong to enslaved individual, which of course does acknowledge their presence on the plantation. But the focus of the image itself is much more on this kind of leisured scene in the centre. And I should just say this is an incredibly rare visual image. It's one of only two known examples that show a Lascelles family plantation in the time of slavery. If anybody's aware of any other, I'd be very happy. I'm very glad to see it. But this echoes numerous written and visual accounts of colonized Caribbean landscapes. Together, text and image works to erase the enslaved people and plantation economy that continued to fund genteel Regency life both abroad and at home. And like so many Britons across the country, Austen and Turner had their own connections to Caribbean plantations and slavery. Early in his career, Turner invested in shares in a Jamaican cattle farm worked by enslaved people. And many of his patrons, of course, like the Lascelles family, had direct involvement in the trafficking of enslaved Africans. Austen, too, had personal connections to slavery through various different family members. She also, interestingly, had two naval officer brothers, Francis and Charles, who were both admirals, who travelled across the British Empire, including the Caribbean. And this picture here actually shows a page from Francis's sketchbook depicting coastal profiles of several Caribbean islands. And interestingly, I think this this depiction really moves beyond those kind of picturesque conventions, but nevertheless still imposes a colonial perspective because, of course, these coastal profiles were taken at a kind of a distance from the island whilst aboard a British ship. And these images include practical details such as distances and compass points as well. And interestingly, sketching was something that all British naval officers were taught during this period as both a crucial tool, both in navigation, but also in documentation of the places that they travelled as well. Now, of course, Austen and Turner's connections to slavery are incredibly complex, and I definitely don't have time to explain that in full here and explain all the relevant details. But it's important to say that both artist and writer were also very much aware and interested in the abolitionist movement as well. The popular anti-slavery writer William Cooper was Austen's favourite poet, for example. And she also declared herself in love with the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson after reading his book in 1808. And Austen, of course, explores the theme of slavery more deeply in Mansfield Park, in which the Bertram home is built on the profits of enslaved labour in Antigua. And there's this one moment where one of the characters refers to the dead silence around slavery when brought up by Fanny Price at the dinner table. And this silence is quite conspicuously at odds with the national and politically urgent conversation around the slave trade at this time. And this sort of dead silence has been interpreted over the years in many ways. But it's safe to say, the silence has kind of intrigued and angered readers and scholars for over 200 years. No one's quite sure how to interpret it. And Turner, of course, also directly addressed the trafficking of African people during this period in his creative work, sort of culminating in a painting produced in 1840. 7 years after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. And it's this picture here, slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, typhoon coming on. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it. Obviously, the work is in the US at the moment. And yeah, it's an incredibly complex and a truly harrowing picture thought to represent the murder of enslaved Africans on the slaving ship, the Zong, in 1781. And we don't have the original picture, the oil painting, in the exhibition. It doesn't travel anymore, but we have featured this work in the form of an engraving within the show. Now, moving on from this theme, I want to highlight, perhaps for me, the most exciting work that we have in the exhibition. And that's this very tiny document here, which is about the size of sort of two hands put together. And this is Austen's unfinished handwritten manuscript for her final novel, which is now known as Sanditon. And of course, she very sadly died during the process of writing it. I'm showing actually here on the right-hand side, the very last line that she wrote within the document, and this is about 4 months before she passed away. And obviously, not only is this document incredibly emotionally charged, but it does also allow us to see, and quite directly, Austen's genius, creative genius at work. And you see her kind of authorial hand unfiltered by the printed page, which is obviously how we're used to reading Austen novels. It kind of allows us to peek behind that creative curtain and see her process as an author, a little bit like, I suppose, one of Turner's sketches. You can see the sort of corrections and adjustments that she's making as she goes. Although I have to admit, the number of these are actually remarkably few, despite the fact that you sense from her handwriting that she's writing at pace. You know, her ideas are, and her story is kind of seems to come kind of thick and fast. You know, and the presence of that hand is quite palpable in this document. And the other very significant thing about Sanditon, of course, is that the novel contains Austen's only character explicitly of African heritage, Miss Lamb, who was a wealthy heiress from the Caribbean. Now, obviously, sadly, because of course the novel is unfinished, we don't know how Miss Lamb's story was sort of intended to pan out. But we do know that she was described as precious, chilly, tender, perhaps where the name Lamb came from. But crucially, Miss Lamb also had a maid. She had the best room in the lodgings and was also of the first consequence of any plan. And her fortune tempts unscrupulous characters into acquiring her wealth through marriage. And it's of note here that Austen kind of sets Miss Lamb up as an heiress of equal standing to that of her white British characters, who also kind of navigate these similar kind of romantic conflicts. And this, of course, very much enriches our understanding of Black British history during this period. And we've actually worked with a contemporary visual artist, Layla Harris, as part of this exhibition. And she was particularly drawn to Miss Lamb as a character, as well as this idea of the fact that her story was untold and unfinished. And she wanted to create a portrait of her using these kind of little fragments of what we know about Miss Lamb from the manuscript. And here she is, sort of caught in a momentary glance, looking up from her book and staring directly at the viewer. And obviously, you can see here that the portrait remains deliberately unfinished. And just as a side as well, I should also say as well as working with Layla, we've also worked with a contemporary writer, Dr. Romy Smith, who has been undertaking a writing residency over the course of the show. So by doing this, bringing in these kind of contemporary artists and writers, we're trying to kind of bring this conversation and sort of echo this conversation between Austen and Turner and bring it into the 21st century. Now, moving on to the kind of next theme and sort of following on from Miss Lamb, I suppose, in terms of the importance of character and sociability within Austen's work. The Regency period is often described as the kind of the age of sociability. It was a time when polite conversation, pleasing manners, and easy relations between people carried a new importance. It was kind of a reaction against the formalities of the past. And Austen, obviously, of course, it's obvious where Austen sits in terms of this theme, but what does that mean for Turner? You know, he's usually known as a painter of nature and landscapes. And so we have these images here, and to my very great surprise when we started research for this exhibition, someone showed me these extraordinary pictures, and which, yeah, I'd never come across before. And they are, in fact, obviously part of the same series of watercolours as the one that I showed you earlier, painted at Petworth House in Sussex. And besides the fact that these basically, again, could serve as a Austen book cover illustration in terms of the scenes they depict, for me, there's something about the kind of brevity of these sketches. Austen Turner, has clearly kind of observed these moments as they're happening, and how economical he is, with his brushstrokes. That really, I think, creates this parallel with Austen. Like Austen, Turner manages to capture the kind of the essence of the scene with just a few kind of brushstrokes, very quick and very subtle, creating these kind of precise character portraits that also have a little bit of kind of humour in them as well. And of course, Austen absolutely was admired for her for the kind of economy and precision of her prose and character building as well. You can also see, I think, in these pictures that Turner here, as an observer of people, you can kind of almost imagine him sat in the corner of a room, sort of sketching away, quite happy with the fact that he actually wasn't involved in the conversation himself. And again, this reminds me of Austen. Someone once described her as a sharp poker in the corner of a room, obviously ready with her sharp wit and intellect to dissect any social situation that was kind of unfolding in front of her. And this is something I can kind of well believe, actually, by looking at some of Austen's own incredibly gossipy correspondence. This is a letter here that we have on display in the exhibition, written by Austen to her sister, Cassandra. And during a particularly dull week in November, so the dreary weather had kind of kept Austen indoors, she turns to her favourite pastime, which is gossip. And within this letter, she insults, everyone from the local clergyman's daughters who have bad breath, to an individual called Mrs. Poor, whose endless jabber is reminiscent of the character Miss Bates in her novel Emma. The best quote, however, is this one here that I picked out, and again illustrates kind of perfectly this idea of Austen as an observer and as someone who kind of relished gossip, particularly at big events like balls where drama would have been everywhere. And she says to Cassandra, I have charged my myrmidons to send me an account of the Basingstoke ball. I have placed my spies at different places that they collect them all, and by doing so, by sending Miss Big to the town hall itself and posting my mother at Steventon, I hope to derive from their various observations a good general idea of the whole. Lady Whistledown, eat your heart out, I think. And fascinatingly, actually, I think is the fact that Turner too was at times captivated by this kind of social intrigue and drama. And this is where I want to share this really rather unusual picture of by Turner. It's an oil painting this time rather than the watercolours we've seen so far, which is actually quite challenging to read visually, or at least at first glance anyway. So I'll just kind of explain what's going on here. You've got two women. Both of them is painted half length. One of the women has her back to the viewer, and her hair's kind of swept up into a bun, and you can kind of see her sort of long neck. And actually, we think this first woman is actually holding a letter behind her back. You can just see a little sort of square sort of shape in white. And then there's the second woman who kind of peers over the shoulder of this first woman, and who appears to be almost, trying to see or grab the letter from the first woman. And it seems to capture this kind of interesting exchange here between the women who, one of them is clearly unwilling to share the contents of her letter. and it just leaves you wondering, what secrets did it contain, and why did she want to conceal it? Particularly, of course, in an age where letters were so often communal methods of communication. They were often read aloud to family members. So, this picture, which is really rather odd and quite truncated in its composition, somehow I think manages to capture the kind of the awkwardness of the social situation it's depicting, and the danger actually involved in sociability of the period as well. Now, I think I've probably talked for quite some time now, so I'm going to leave you with this rather mysterious image here. And again, another one of my favourite works in the show. Again, this is from the Tate's collection, and it's a large oil painting, again, rather than a watercolour. And again, I've just added a picture there for scale, so it's much bigger than the other works that we've talked about, and you would be forgiven again for wondering what on earth is going on with this picture. It's an unfinished picture, an interesting parallel to Austen's unfinished manuscript. But when this painting was first exhibited in the early 20th century, one critic quipped that it might just well hang upside down, and that's how confusing this image was at the time, and I think it's remained a puzzle really ever since. But as its modern title suggests, Interior of a Great House, the picture's subject can be identified just about as an interior of the type, of course, often found in British country houses. So we can see here, we can just about pick out a curved ceiling. We've got a deep sort of window bay to the right-hand side. We've got an arched doorway straight ahead with two possibly mirrored niches either side. And then we've got a fireplace with a gilded overmantel mirror on the left. But the rest of the room's features, of course, seem to dissolve into this barely distinguishable sort of jumble in the middle of the picture. There might be a sofa in there, that sort of red shape. There might also be an overturned chair, if you can pick out the shape of the leg there. Possibly a reflected portrait, and even a pack of excitable dogs as well. The little white flecks of paint have been interpreted as dogs. And as I say, this picture has been interpreted in many ways, everything from a funerary scene to the aftermath of an evening's costume party. No one's really sure what Turner's depicting here. But I think to search for a specific meaning in this work is perhaps a little misguided. And I think Turner here presents a scene that is deliberately ambiguous and experimental. And it was painted, of course, at a time in Turner's career when his fascination with light, colour and abstraction were very much reaching their peak. And here I think Turner is leaning into that and looking to capture something much more sensory about, the wonderfully rich historic interiors that he would have been privileged enough to spend time in. And he's much more interested in conveying the kind of the unique atmosphere of these places. And I think that's why I personally find this image so compelling as well, because I'm also very privileged enough to be able to experience the kind of the special magic of these interiors on a day-to-day basis, and understand that these spaces are designed to be immersive and sensory and awe-inspiring in equal measure as well. And I think this is what Turner is trying to achieve here. And with that, I'm going to leave it there. I hope that's been kind of an interesting romp through our current exhibition. I have to say, sadly, the exhibition closes in just a couple of weeks. So unless you literally jump on a plane tomorrow, you probably won't get a chance to see it in person. But if anyone obviously is interested in finding out more about the exhibition, then we have indeed produced a catalogue, and actually I've kind of quoted from it in areas of this presentation today, which you can obviously purchase via our website. And yeah, if you can't make the exhibition, hopefully this might have inspired you to come visit Harewood on another occasion also. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Becky, for that really wonderfully informative presentation. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I would like to mention. On October 15th, our American Inspiration Author Series will present Lineage, Genealogy and the Power of Connection in Early America with author Karen Wolfe. On October 17th, I will be hosting our old friend Christopher Ridgway for Castle Howard's 21st Century Renaissance. And lastly, on October 23rd, Dory Lawson, David McCullough's daughter, discusses the value of history on the occasion of the publication of History Matters, a posthumously published collection of her father's essays. You can find more information about all these programs at americanancestors.org/events. We also have 3 2026 Heritage Tours that I would like to highlight. In May, we'll be touring our wonderful home city of Boston. In September, we'll be seeing the best country houses in Ireland. And in December, we'll have a magical London Christmas tour. You can find more information about these tours and add your name to the interest list by going to americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Now, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time we have left. I'm going to start off with the first question. Can you tell us, Becky, why I say Harwood and you say Harewood?
Yeah, so this sort of slight difference in pronunciation really is a result of we sort of rebranded, as it were, recently. So historically, Harewood has always been known as Harewood, or at least the family title has always been known as Harewood, and the house as well as Harewood. But ironically, the village has always been known as Harewood. And you know, there's always historically been a debate about you know, how the houses and the village is pronounced. And there's this fabulous story actually of one side of the village saying Harewood and the other side of the village saying Harwood. So there's always been a bit debate about this, but we made the decision a few years ago, almost as like a part of a rebranding exercise, to try and simplify the pronunciation for everyone. So we decided to go for Harewood because obviously that's how it's spelt. But now I feel like I answer more questions about which is which still. So I'm not sure it really fulfilled that need, but here we are.
How do you think that Austen and Turner, as outsiders, shaped the perception of the British country house that we see today? What I would add to that is I think oftentimes outsiders see things in a different way than the people who grew up with them, and sometimes they expand how they're seen.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this was one of the things that we noticed when we were planning the exhibition sort of quite early on, in that, you know, because they are sort of outsiders to this world, they could in some ways, in certain scenarios, be kind of a little bit more critical about what they were viewing. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a concise answer here. But yeah, I think, I don't know, it gave them a little bit of an edge that I think that they might not have had they have been fully immersed, you know, within that world themselves, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense, actually. Can you tell us if the ruins of Harewood Castle still stand?
They do, yes. So Harewood Castle still, the castle itself looks very much like the castle in the Turner picture, but interestingly, there's basically a forest that's kind of grown up around the castle. So it looks very different in terms of the landscape around it than the picture I showed earlier. But yeah, it's still very, very much there, and you still can kind of walk around it, retracing Turner's footsteps, as it were. Yeah.
This is an interesting question. How did the letter from Jane to Cassandra escape burning by Cassandra later?
Oh, that's a good question, and I don't know precisely. I mean, there are a handful of letters that did escape because they survive in collections. So Jane Austen House has quite a few. The British Library has a few. That's where we lent this letter from. And there's a fantastic a book, and I'm going to forget the scholar's name now. Deirdre Le Fay, I think her name is, and she transcribed all the surviving letters, so you can actually, go and read the surviving ones. And I'm not sure, you know, how or why specific ones were sort of saved, as it were. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe that's a question for an Austen specialist.
No, we've always heard that Cassandra burned everything after Jane's death. So I think there's always a chance in those situations that one or two letters escapes or were sent to somebody in the outside world, and they, luckily
Yeah, I
for
mean,
us.
yeah, I was going to say I don't know whether it's. I mean, there is quite a few that did survive, and I wonder whether it's a little bit of a myth that everything was burnt, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that possibility. Can you tell us why in Turner's painting the slaves were being thrown overboard?
Yeah, so this picture, we think, although it's not certain, depicts um, uh, the slaving ship, the Zong, and essentially at the time, so there was a storm coming on, basically, in the middle of the Atlantic, and the slavers basically threw the enslaved people overboard because it was a kind of it's to do with like an insurance claim, and I forget the finer details. And in fact, again, this is something that is very well documented. It was very well kind of covered in the press at the time, and particularly amongst kind of abolitionist writers. And it was one of the kind of the key events. This horrendous moment where people were being thrown overboard. For the simple purposes of things like an insurance claim. It was one of those kind of moments that really sort of spurred on the abolition of slavery itself, particularly in the British Empire anyway.
I'll jump in because I was lucky enough to work for 13 years at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston, who owns that painting. And my understanding is that all slaves were insured, but their lives were insured only if they died through a storm. In other words, if you were sick and you were dying, and you did die, there would be no money due from the insurance policy. But if you happened to be thrown overboard in a storm and you were lost at sea, then the insurance money would be paid. And what these captains did, the captains, of course, also got part of the money from the slaves from their trading. They would take sick and dying slaves and hope for a storm, and then put chains on them and throw them overboard so that they would drown, thereby saying a storm came up and these slaves were swept overboard and we couldn't stop it. What a shame. And here's our claim for the insurance money. And I know that Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, was very taken by this particular painting by Turner, and it inspired him to sort of be a proponent for the abolition of slavery around the world. It's an incredible painting to stand in front of, because what you don't see until you get very close and spend time looking at it is what's going on in the water. You can see feet and arms um, basically covered in chains. You can see big fish, possibly whales, coming up to try to eat them. It's meant to be just what it is, horrific, and as something that tells us all how horrible slavery is and was. I'm going to end on a happier question, which is it true that Jane Austen is the only woman, other than the Queen, Elizabeth II, ever to appear on an English banknote?
Oh, that is a good question, and I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, I would be sort of surprised if that was the case. Again, that's something I would have to look up. I'm just trying
No
to think
struggles
of
here.
anybody else.
It's an interesting thought. One of the things I have to say, speaking of Elizabeth, the Queen, is that her visage, a picture of her face, has appeared more times in the history of humanity than anyone except Jesus
Mhm.
Christ, which is an astonishing statistic and something I think that will never be repeated again in human history because no one will have lived as long as she did and reigned as long as she did. So that's all the time we have today for questions, everybody. If you have questions we haven't answered, you can always email us at heritagetours@americanancestors.org. Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. I want to thank Beckie again and want to tell everybody to stay safe, stay healthy, and hope to see you again on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.